You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 227. You're listening to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with resources to navigate the challenges and opportunities of courageous, Christ-centered leaders.
Sarah, I'm going to start this episode with a question. How do you tell the difference between giving and receiving grace?
That's a good question. Hang on to it for just a moment as I remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/227. The show notes are a great place for you to listen and share this episode with others. Maybe there's someone in your life that needs some encouragement from the means of grace, and you can share this series with them.
So today we're setting the stage for a series on hope and the means of grace. There's a twofold purpose for this series. First is to encourage you as Christ-centered leaders to tend to your own faith formation. And second, to revisit the means of grace as a source of hope.
So in each episode, we'll explore one big idea as well as answer two questions. What's the leadership message, and where is their hope? So, Tim, you asked a question as we were getting started. How do you tell the difference between giving and receiving grace? And I am 100% certain you were not setting us up for a joke.
No, when I think about giving and receiving grace, I mean, it's the word in the scripture for grace is charis, means gift. And when I think of that from that perspective, I remember a story that Dr. Fred Craddock used to tell out of his childhood. He was part of a youth group and lived in a very poor section of the community where they were, and there were people that needed food or needed help. Everyone helped one another. But one of the things that the youth group did would be to put together baskets of food, non-perishables or sometimes fruit, vegetables, and then non-perishables. And they would take them to a person's house, knock on the door, and then run and hide and watch them as they came to the door for the food. It was just, I think he said it was, you're not supposed to be doing it to get credit for something. So by leaving it, they weren't going to get the credit for doing it. And he said one time it was his turn to leave the basket or the bag or whatever it was on the porch, and he knocked on the door. Everybody ran, but before he could set the bag down and run, the door opened. And there was a little boy that answered the door, and Craddock said, the only thing I knew to do was to hand the basket or the bag, whatever, to the little boy. And at that time, his mother came to the door. And he said, I have brought this for you. This is a gift for you. And she invited him in. And he sat down, and the little boy sat down. He was bringing the basket to them because they needed the food. But the little boy took an apple out of the basket and then gave it back to him. So he was giving the gift, but the little boy was giving him a gift. And if I remember Dr. Craddock correctly, he says, when you're in the midst of grace, you don't know whether you're giving or receiving. So that's where my question came from today.
Charis, I never say that correctly. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And in the Greek, and then hesed in Hebrew is what gets translated both grace and gift. That's what you were pointing to. Now I've added the Hebrew word in there as well, which translates grace, mercy, steadfast love, favor. And in both of those contexts, there is a giving and receiving. And grace, if you look at the scriptures, there's a variety of contexts. But Tim, what you're pointing to are two of those contexts. One in which someone grants to another the action of one who volunteers to do something that's not otherwise obligatory. And then the second is a response to generosity or thanks or gratitude. And what you just illustrated is both of those in the very same place, the giving and the receiving. Now, the definition of grace that I learned somewhere along the line was that grace is the undeserved, unmerited love of God. There's nothing that we can do to earn it. It is a gift. If God is merciful, if God's steadfast love is present in our life, for me, it's pretty obvious where you can find hope. So, since we're talking in this series about hope in the means of grace, Tim, where is there hope in the means of grace?
Well, Sarah, I thought you were going to keep going. That would have been good. There is hope in the means of grace, and not trying to answer a question with the same words as your question. But Wesley reminded us, by means of grace, we're talking about outward signs, words, or actions that are ordained by God. They're ordinary channels where you might, as Wesley would say, whereby we might convey to men preventing, justifying, and sanctifying grace.
Okay, so that's Wesley talking. And so, yeah, he's talking about men.
Right.
In 2022, we would probably make that word humans, people. So just hear it for when it was said and when it was written.
So for all of us, it's those ordinary, and he said channels, it's the ordinary practices where you and I, men and women, adults and children, might experience or participate in the preventing, justifying, and sanctifying grace. Now, Wesley named those. I don't know that he always named them all at the same time, but there were those that the chief means of grace, prayer, whether in secret or in the congregation. He said, searching the scriptures. And I think what we're talking about there is that we're reading, hearing, and meditating upon the scriptures and receiving the Lord's Supper, eating bread, drinking wine in remembrance of Christ. And as Wesley said, these we believe to be ordained of God as the ordinary channels of conveying his grace to the souls of all people. He said men, but we'll say all people. So the means of grace are a concrete spiritual discipline set apart by God as the most reliable way we receive preventing, justifying, sanctifying grace.
So wherever we are on our journeys of faith, what I'm hearing you point to via Mr. Wesley is that grace abounds. I think sometimes we jump over prevenient grace or preventing grace. So can we talk about that one for just a moment? Sometimes I think we talk about making decisions for Jesus, or we talk about our faith journey from that moment that a decision was made to follow Jesus, as if we're implying that once we made a decision, that initiated God's presence in our life. And part of what I love about the means of grace and where I see the hope coming through is God's presence precedes our decision. And that's what prevenient grace reminds us of. God's gift to us were there before we ever thought to name it or ask it or even respond to it.
God's prevenient grace, preventing grace, may have been the very reason you made a decision.
Exactly.
That's what you're talking about. It may have been that prompting of God, because God is always coming before us. So God's gifts coming before us may happen with family. And I have that experience myself with my grandmother, just reading the scriptures to me on every evening. And I'm making fun of her, but that was God using her to prompt me, or praying for me at night when I would go to bed. So God's gifts have come before any of you, and some of you may think about it, whether it was at a camp when you were camping, or vacation Bible school, or you're with just something as common as a movie with a friend. God's grace is moving, and whether it's grace that precedes faith, meets you in faith, or helps you grow in the likeness of Christ, It's what we're talking about. Grace abounds. So for our purposes, those ordinary channels of grace that Wesley pointed to remind us that there is hope in prayer, in searching the Scripture, and in Holy Communion. And Sarah, if I'm not mistaken, next week we're going to talk about the misunderstandings of the means of grace. But for today, right now, because of God's grace, there's always hope. And the means of grace are a way for us to encounter the love of God that we know in Jesus. But it does raise a question for me. As leaders, are you on the giving or receiving end of God's grace? I think I've asked that question before. Are you on the giving or receiving end of God's grace? And really, if you deal with that question, you become bathed in grace. So that's why we ask the question.
Tim's not going to let that question go today on this episode. And if you're asking me, I hope the answer to that question is, I hope you're on both ends. I hope you're on the giving end and the receiving end. I hope that as a leader, you model grace, invite people to encounter God in the midst of grace, that you share grace, and that, yes, you're also receiving grace.
And Sarah, I want to remind the people who are listening that the definition that you and I use for disciple is a grace-filled Christ follower who puts faith into action.
So how can you embrace that definition and not be on both the giving and receiving ends of grace? And so as leaders, maybe the hope and reminder for you today is simply this: the unmerited love of God abounds in the means of grace, whether it's through prayer, reading and searching the Scriptures, the sacrament of Holy Communion. Maybe you need that reminder, or maybe the people that you're leading need to remember that. Either way, grace abounds.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm thinking as we are talking about whether we're giving or receiving, when we do recognize we're receiving God's grace, and that may be sometimes just the forgiveness that we receive, or it may be that we are just so surprised by the love or the appreciation of somebody else has for us. It's almost impossible not to turn around and offer it back. Now, that doesn't mean that you might not experience some of those things and you'd say, why in the world are they doing that to me and all that? And I would say, you probably didn't get the full force of the grace. Because when grace abounds, and you're receiving that grace, it's very difficult not to turn around and give it back. And it may not be back to the same person that's been giving you, that has bestowed grace upon you. It may very well be on somebody else.
So what you're now pointing to, Tim, I'm sorry if I interrupted you, is grace invites a response.
Exactly. And we cultivate that response through prayer, searching the Scripture, and through Holy Communion. It helps us not only recognize the grace in which we're living, but it also helps loosen our giving to bestow grace upon others.
So that's where we're heading for the next few weeks as we explore the means of grace, where grace and hope abound. So let me remind you as we conclude this episode that you can find the show notes at transformingmission.org/227. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.